In episode 69, titled Host Attack Mini-Scenarios, we're using fast drills to practice host-based reasoning under constraints, because host work is where small details can quickly become big consequences.
When you have access to a machine, you can often do a lot, and that a lot is exactly why you need discipline. The best host operators are not the ones who run the most commands. They are the ones who choose the next step that increases certainty or capability without creating instability, scope violations, or evidence problems.
Host scenarios also tend to blend multiple topics, such as privilege levels, misconfigurations, credential artifacts, and legitimate tool abuse, so you need a structured loop to keep your reasoning clean.
These drills train you to name your access level, pick a controlled action, justify why it is safe and allowed, and reassess based on what you learn.
The goal is not to do everything, it is to do the right next thing.
The drill loop is simple. Identify access level, choose an action, justify it, and reassess.
Access level means you state what you currently have, such as a standard user context, a local admin context, or a constrained service context, because that determines what is feasible and what is risky.
Choosing an action means selecting the smallest step that either confirms an assumption or increases capability in a way aligned with the objective. Justifying means explaining why the action is phase-appropriate, low-risk, and within scope, and what evidence it will produce that supports a conclusion.
Reassessing means you do not keep running the same playbook regardless of results. You let evidence change the plan. This loop is especially important on hosts because uncontrolled changes can destabilize systems, trigger defenses, or create persistence you did not intend. A disciplined loop keeps host work professional rather than chaotic.
Scenario 1 begins with user access gained, and the decision is whether to enumerate or escalate first.
Imagine you have a standard user shell on a host, and you are tempted to jump straight into privilege escalation because it feels like the fastest path to meaningful control.
The key clue is that you do not yet know what this host is, what it touches, or what constraints exist, so blind escalation attempts can be noisy, risky, and unnecessary.
The best next step is usually targeted enumeration that answers the highest value questions with minimal noise, such as what the host's role is, what high-value processes or services run, what privileges the user has, and whether obvious escalation patterns are present. This is not enumerate everything, it is enumerate enough to choose an escalation path responsibly. If you discover that the host is sensitive or production critical, your escalation strategy may need coordination, and enumeration helps you make that call early. In host work, knowing what you are standing on is often more valuable than sprinting forward. Alternatives fail in Scenario 1 when they skip prerequisites or create unnecessary risk. Jumping into escalation without understanding the host role can be wrong because it may trigger instability, change system state, or draw defensive attention without improving your evidence position. Over-enumeration can also fail because dumping massive inventories or running heavy discovery tools can create noise and potentially impact performance, especially on resource-constrained systems. Another alternative is doing nothing because you already have access, which fails because access without understanding does not translate into a defensible plan or actionable findings.
The disciplined middle path is to enumerate only what you need to decide whether escalation is appropriate and what the safest route might be. That route reduces both false assumptions and operational risk.
When you can articulate why escalate immediately and enumerate everything are both wrong, you're demonstrating controlled reasoning. Scenario 2 centers on a privileged service found, and your goal is to plan safe confirmation of permissions rather than to rush into changing files or triggering restarts. Imagine you discover a service running with high privilege that references an executable or script path, and you suspect weak permissions on that path. The key clue is the mismatch, a high-privilege process depending on something potentially controllable by a lower-privilege user, which is a classic escalation pattern.
The safest next action is to confirm the service context and the effective permissions on the referenced path and its parent directories, because that tells you whether control is actually possible.
You focus on observing and measuring, not modifying, because the act of replacing a service binary is disruptive and often unnecessary to prove the risk. If you can demonstrate that a standard user can modify what a privileged service runs, you have a strong finding, even without executing a disruptive proof. Safe confirmation here produces a clear condition that defenders can fix, which is the real objective.
Evidence to note in Scenario 2 should be specific and minimal: paths, permissions, and the resulting capability change that the misconfiguration would enable.
You record the service's run level conceptually, meaning whether it runs with elevated authority, because privilege is the impact multiplier. You record the exact path the service uses, including any intermediate directories that might be writable, because the controllable path is the mechanism.
You record effective permissions from the perspective of the user context you currently hold, because writable by someone is not enough. It needs to be writable by the attacker-relevant account.
You then describe the capability change that would result, such as a low-privileged user being able to influence execution under high privilege without actually performing the replacement in a sensitive environment.
This evidence is strong because it links condition to outcome in a way defenders can reproduce.
The best evidence is the kind that proves the point without altering production systems. Scenario 3 begins when credentials are discovered, and the decision is how to handle reuse boundaries and choose the next target safely.
Imagine you find an administrative credential artifact on the host, such as a stored secret in a configuration file, a cached session token, or evidence of reused credentials in automation scripts.
The key clue is that credentials represent identity and are portable, but portability is exactly why mishandling them can create major safety and scope issues. Your first move is to classify what you found by privilege and scope, such as whether it appears to be local-only, domain-wide, service-specific, or tied to a high-value account. Then you decide what reuse is permitted by the rules of engagement, because using discovered credentials outside authorization boundaries can quickly become a policy violation. If use is permitted, the safest next target is usually the minimal system that confirms scope, such as verifying whether the credential works in the intended context without broad login attempts across many systems. The aim is to confirm reuse risk with minimal disruption, not to turn credential discovery into wide authentication testing. Safer choices in Scenario 3 emphasize confirming scope, limiting use, and documenting handling, because credential work is where professional discipline is most visible. Confirming scope means determining where the credential should work and where it does work, but doing so with minimal attempts and clear stop rules to avoid lockouts and user disruption. Limiting use means you do not test the credential across a fleet or against unrelated systems just because you can. You choose the smallest use that proves impact. Documenting handling means you record that the credential was found and accessible, but you avoid copying secret values into notes or reports, and you describe evidence in a way that supports remediation and rotation. You also consider immediate containment recommendations, such as rotation and revocation, because once a secret is exposed, the risk persists until it is changed. These safer choices protect the client and protect the engagement, because mishandled credentials can create a secondary incident. The goal is to turn credential discovery into an actionable finding, not into a collection exercise. Scenario 4 involves built-in tools being available, and the task is to infer a living-off-the-land opportunity without assuming that normal tools are automatically malicious. Imagine you observe that the host has scripting and scheduling utilities available, and you notice activity patterns where files are moved and new tasks are created. The key clue is not the existence of the tools, but the context and outcome, who is using them, when, and what they are being used to accomplish.
If a standard user context is creating scheduled tasks or moving files into unusual locations, that suggests a potential persistence or staging pattern using legitimate capabilities.
In an assessment mindset, you treat this as a behavior pattern to validate, such as confirming what the task runs and whether it aligns with sanctioned administration practices, while avoiding actions that would create persistence yourself.
This scenario trains you to interpret intent from sequences rather than from tool names. The defensive value is that you can recommend monitoring and least privilege improvements that reduce these opportunities.
Pitfalls across these scenarios tend to cluster around assumptions, overcollection, and uncontrolled changes. Assumptions show up when you treat a suspected escalation path as proven without confirming effective permissions, or when you treat a found credential as broadly reusable without validating scope. Overcollection shows up when you gather too many secrets, too many logs, or too many artifacts, creating unnecessary exposure and compliance risk. Uncontrolled changes show up when you modify service binaries, change scheduled tasks, or attempt escalations on sensitive hosts without rollback planning, creating outages or persistent side effects. Another pitfall is letting curiosity override boundaries, especially when a host appears to offer many opportunities, because that can lead to scope creep. The professional habit is to confirm first, change only when necessary, and document everything that matters to reproduce and remediate. When you avoid these pitfalls, host work stays safe, credible, and useful. Quick wins in host scenarios come from picking the smallest step that increases certainty or capability, because those steps keep you moving without creating unnecessary noise. In Scenario 1, the quick win is targeted enumeration that clarifies host role and privilege opportunities before escalation. In Scenario 2, the quick win is permission confirmation on privileged service paths, because it can prove an escalation condition without disruptive execution. In Scenario 3, the quick win is responsible credential scope confirmation with minimal attempts, paired with safe handling and immediate remediation guidance. In Scenario 4, the quick win is context validation of suspicious task and file movement behavior, focusing on whether actions align with legitimate maintenance patterns. The shared theme is minimal, high-signal actions that produce evidence and reduce uncertainty. When you can consistently choose quick wins like these, you become faster and safer at the same time. To keep the drill consistent, use this memory anchor: access, permissions, credentials, movement, evidence. Access reminds you to start by naming what level of control you have and what that implies. Permissions reminds you that local escalation often hinges on who can modify what a privileged process uses. Credentials reminds you that secrets are portable leverage and must be handled with strict safeguards. Movement reminds you to think about how access could expand, whether through escalation on the same host or through authorized next targets. Evidence reminds you that every step should produce minimal, credible artifacts that support conclusions and remediation. This anchor keeps your reasoning structured and prevents you from chasing the most exciting action. It also helps you communicate clearly because it mirrors how defenders think about risk. Many review the scenarios by summarizing each best next step succinctly, so the drill becomes instinctive. In Scenario 1, after gaining user access, the best next step is targeted enumeration to identify host role, privileges, and safe escalation opportunities before attempting escalation. In Scenario 2, after finding a privileged service, the best next step is to confirm effective permissions on the service's referenced paths and document the privilege mismatch without making disruptive changes. In Scenario 3, after discovering credentials, the best next step is to classify privilege and scope, handle the secret responsibly, and perform only minimal, authorized validation to confirm reuse risk. In Scenario 4, when built-in tools are available, the best next step is to evaluate context and outcomes, confirming whether task creation and file movement patterns indicate misuse without creating persistence yourself. Each step is chosen because it increases certainty with minimal operational impact. That is the core of the drill method.
To conclude episode 69, titled Host Attack Mini-Scenarios, remember that host-based work rewards discipline because small actions can have large effects and evidence quality matters. The drill method keeps you grounded. Identify access level, choose a minimal action, justify it, and reassess based on results. Replay scenario 2 with a new justification as practice. When you find a privileged service, you confirm the service's privilege context and the effective permissions on its executable path before any further action, because proving a controllable path under elevated privilege provides strong evidence without risking service disruption. You avoid replacing binaries or forcing restarts because those steps can create outages and are unnecessary to establish the misconfiguration. You document the path, the permissions, and the capability change that would result, enabling defenders to fix the condition confidently. When you can justify that calmly, you are practicing host reasoning the way professionals do. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.